26/11/2022, the 14th anniversary of the Mumbai terror attack in which 166 people were killed. As we pay tribute to those who lost their lives in the dastardly attack, justice eludes them and their families as the perpetrators of the orchestrated attack are still at large, protected under political shadow. It's a well-known fact that terrorism is the biggest threat to global peace, security, stability, and prosperity. It is a persistent global threat that knows no border, nationality, or religion. As per the 2022 Global Terrorism Index report, the number of terror attacks increased by 17% to 5,226, with South Asia recording more than 1,800 deaths in 2021 alone. The use of new and emerging technologies has further complicated this threat. No country, however rich or powerful, will be able to counter the multi-layered and complex threats rendered by terrorism. It is a challenge that the international community must tackle together. So the question here is, in the face of this evolving threat, what coordinated efforts are being undertaken to counter terrorism in its different manifestations and also combat terror financing? That's the global debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Tina Jha. This year, India has held a series of anti-terrorist conferences to bring the world's attention towards the changing dynamics of terrorism, use of formal and informal channels of funding for terrorism, and the need for enhanced global cooperation to address these evolving threats of terrorism. So what have been the outcomes of these high-level conferences? What kind of strategy is needed to uproot the scourge of terrorism? An illustrious panel of experts joins us on the program today to discuss these aspects and much more. Very pleased to welcome on this edition of the Global Debate, Dr. Arvind Gupta, Director, Vivekananda International Foundation. He joined us from New Delhi. Dr. Rohan Gunaratna, Professor of Security Studies, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU, Singapore. And Dr. Sameer Patil, Senior Fellow, ORF, Mumbai. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on the program. Dr. Sameer Patil, let me begin the program today with you. You've written an elaborate piece on the evolving threats of terrorism and India's counter-terrorism engagements in recent months. So to begin with, let's first understand what have been the focus areas of these engagements and any concrete outcome that you see in the fight against terror.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the program. So as you mentioned, India has held 3 important counterterrorism meetings in the last few weeks. The No Money for Terror conference, which was hosted by the Ministry of Home Affairs, the United Nations special meeting of the Counterterrorism Committee, which happened in Mumbai and New Delhi in the last week of October, and the Interpol's 19th General Assembly, which happened in New Delhi subsequently. I think these 3 meetings have highlighted India's unique contribution to fight terrorism's challenge at the global level, as well as also draw the world's attention to the continuing battle that we face in our neighborhood. These 3 meetings, in a sense, have drawn attention to the 2 issues, which you also mentioned in your introductory remarks. One is the use of the emerging technologies. In fact, the focus of the United Nations CTC meeting was only on the use of emerging technologies. In the last few years, we have seen technologies such as the onion router, the dark net, then also the VPN, as well as the 3D printing and the drones. The terrorists have extensively used these technologies to perpetuate their activities. Particularly in the cyberspace, we have seen the onion router and the VPN being used by the terrorist groups to carry out propaganda as well as recruit more people into their ranks. So the UNCTC meeting has drawn attention to this particular emerging phenomenon. And the No Money for Terror conference, as you mentioned, has drawn attention to the challenge of terrorism financing. And here also we face 2 unique challenges. On one hand of the spectrum, we have the use of the traditional methods, such as the Hawala, which continues to remain resilient despite all the crackdown from the security agencies. We have seen these systems still being used by the Pakistan-based anti-India terrorist groups to finance their activities through the donations which come from the Friday prayers as well as religious charities being laundered through the Hawala. And on the other hand, we also see the use of technologies such as the cryptocurrencies to launder money, again for the terrorist financing purpose. So the challenges that we face are really unique. And again, the No Money for Terror conference has helped us to draw attention to this unique challenge that we face in the world today in battling terrorism. The Delhi Declaration, which came out of the UNCTC meeting, has drawn attention to the use of emerging technologies, and in particular, it also drew attention to the continued role of the terrorist safe havens, without mentioning any particular state. But that, in a sense, sends an unequivocal message from the United Nations that the United Nations stands with India in its battle against terrorism. And as we have seen, the speeches that both Home Minister and Prime Minister gave at the No Money for Terror conference, again, India has been at the forefront of highlighting these challenges, and that has come out really strongly through these expanded counterterrorism engagements in the last few weeks.
Okay. Dr. Gunaratna, with evolving technology, the dynamics of terrorism have also changed at a time when the world should be, should be proactive in finding global solutions and implementing them to counter terror. The irony is that under international law, we are still struggling to have a clear-cut definition of what terrorism is. What does that say about the fight against terror?
Terrorism is the threat and the act of politically motivated violence against civilians. So wherever civilians are attacked, and if the attack is politically motivated, it is terrorism. I don't think that anyone should doubt that the Mumbai attack or the Easter Sunday attack or 9/11, these were terrorist attacks. What is important is for governments to work together. If governments are unwilling to have exchange of personnel between their countries, law enforcement, military intelligence, if governments are unwilling to have common databases to share information and intelligence, if governments are unwilling to do joint training and joint operations, and if governments are unwilling to share resources and technology to fight terrorism, we will have more terrorism in the coming years. So I want to share with you that we have to move from counterterrorism cooperation to collaboration and partnership. The second aspect is this. India has done brilliantly to raise the specialist tactical units to fight terrorism. But India has been very unsuccessful, and so has many other countries, including Sri Lanka, to create the framework to fight radicalization. That is, exclusivist Muslims will become extremist Muslims, and a very small percentage of those extremist Muslims will embrace terrorism. So the way forward is for governments to work with the Muslim religious leaders and secular leaders to counter the extremist and the exclusivist ideologies that are currently taking root in the subcontinent, especially in South India and in Eastern Sri Lanka. I see this as a common threat. India in the past was challenged with similar threats in the north, but we are seeing that threat has now cascaded to the south. And also these threats have entered South India. And now I am seeing an arc developing that involves Maldives, Sri Lanka, and India. And I think we should work together. We should ensure that there is no Easter Sunday style attack again. And there should be better understanding between these three countries, at least to detect and disrupt the threat that is going to manifest in the coming months and coming years.
Okay, Dr. Gupta, taking on from what Dr. Gunaratna says, the fact that the world now needs to move away from cooperation towards collaboration and partnership. But the fact is that will any of these efforts succeed till the time we see terrorism in our versus your framework? Until we address that question, will any of these efforts, will any of the global strategies work?
Well, if you look at the history of cooperation to combat terrorism, which, even in the 90s, much before 9/11, Mumbai, etc., there were UN General Assembly resolutions, and so many. And during the Taliban, the first phase, there were a lot of focus on terrorism and on cooperation. But regrettably, this has not really resulted in containing the spread of terrorism. If at all, the terrorism has increased, as you yourself quoted some data that despite a history of cooperation, terrorism has increased. And I think there are several reasons for this, and your question has the answer to that. And that is that there is no willingness in the international community to cooperate with each other, let alone collaborate, which is a higher stage of cooperation. Unfortunately, today we still see double standards on terrorism, though it may be very easy to define terrorism, as Professor Gunaratne mentioned. But still, we see that the Indian proposal for a comprehensive convention on international terrorism in 2.5 decades has made no progress whatsoever. We have seen even in FATF, which is otherwise a very good organization, there also a lot of politics is played out, and recent Pakistan was moved out of the grey list, and it has now become a normal country. But we know very well that terror financing and terrorism continues to remain a problem, a very big problem in Pakistan for the region. So we have also seen China has repeatedly blocked the Indian efforts to get certain terrorists listed as global terrorists. So there is this complete lack of cooperation. So yes, these conferences are very important, and they do help in terms of bringing the law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies, and other agencies together. But I think the political will is still missing. So I think it is still some distance that the international community will unite and fight terrorism.
Dr. Patil, the fact that, the challenges are many, the technology-driven landscape of terrorism and the different forms of manifestation pose grave threat to India, because we have been victims of terrorism for long, even before the world began to take note of it. The fortunate thing is we have come out of that victimhood. We now want to take the lead and want some kind of global cooperation, some proactive global solutions to this scourge of terrorism. If there is unwillingness, if there are double standards on parts of countries in describing good terrorists and bad terrorists, how are we going to address it? What's the way forward? Dr. Patil.
So, as Dr. Gupta and Professor Gunaratna mentioned, that there is still some lack of willingness in terms of international cooperation when it comes to fighting terrorism. I think one way to go about it, which is what has probably dominated the approach of many states which have been at the receiving end of terrorism, is actually the coalition of the willing approach. And that is how we have seen how at the Financial Action Task Force, a group of countries which are willing to seriously tackle the problem of terrorism coming together to ensure that countries such as Pakistan, which have been peddling terrorism as well as supporting the terrorist groups, that they are isolated and put on the grey list. Of course, as Dr. Gupta mentioned, there's also the politics of countering the terrorism, and that in a sense sometimes brings some kind of a difference in approach of even the countries which are part of the coalition of the willing. But I think that's the way forward, and I think that is how India is looking at this particular strategy, which is why India in the last few years has actually intensified counterterrorism cooperation with countries which at least are on one page when it comes to fighting terrorism. United States, France, Australia, and even this issue has figured in the Quad, which is itself like a coalition of the willing. So I think that will be the approach going forward when it comes to countering terrorism. And I think secondly will be second issue dimension of this will be involving more and more stakeholders in battling terrorism. If you take the example of, for instance, the cryptocurrency and the Hawala transactions, one important stakeholder there is the financial sector. In terms of cryptocurrency, we have all the cryptocurrency houses which actually facilitate these transactions. And similarly, in the case of the Hawala, we have all these remittance operating companies which also facilitate some kind of counter to Hawala. I think we need more and more stakeholders from the financial sector to ensure that we are able to counter this menace of terrorist financing.
All right, Professor Gunaratna, so on the challenge of terror financing, India has proposed setting up of a permanent secretariat to combat terror financing because that today is a much bigger problem. How do you look at this proposal? You are an international expert on counter-terrorism. You've worked in this area for several years. How do you look at this proposal and what is the kind of global response do you think this is going to solicit?
Terrorist finance is the lifeblood of a terrorist organization, meaning no terrorist group can exist without terrorist finance. But for us to be successful, not only should the secretariat be established, but we should build those crucial trusted relationships between government, that is that secretariat, and with the banking and the financial community. Because terrorist money or terrorist resources can be detected in 4 stages. One is in the collection stage, other is in the storage stage, third is in the movement stage, and fourth is in the dispersal stage. Governments are able to detect terrorist money only if they work with the banking and the financial institutions. And we have to build trusted relationships and partnerships with the banking and the financial institutions. Governments are unwilling to do this because government officers are very poorly trained when it comes to detecting terrorist money. They want to keep the secrets themselves. But if they work with the banking and financial institutions by building those partnerships, then governments will be able to do the detections very efficiently. So it is not only building that secretariat, of course, that is a very important step, but we have to train the staff, change their mindset, and get them to work very closely with the 10,000 banks and the financial institutions in our region. Thank you.
You're right. I think that was adequately described as well at the No Money for Terror conference, that today terror financing is more dangerous than terrorism itself. Dr. Gupta, you know, I was going through the counter-terrorism strategies of several countries like the US, like the UK, also European countries. And I happened to, you know, come across one mutual point which talked about assisting the developing countries, the countries that are more vulnerable to terrorism, assisting them in ways to combat terrorism. And this suddenly, brought me to also the aspect of climate finance. The UN climate conference has just ended. And climate finance was one area which was talked about a lot. And it was expected that these countries, the developed world that had made a promise to the developing countries, would fulfill the promise. It remains on paper. Do you think all of this remains mere talk, remains part of the strategy, but does not fructify?
I think this is not a developed country versus a developing country problem, because in this terrorism landscape, both countries have suffered. And I think despite the fact that there are double standards and there are some unwillingness, but many countries, I think, are on the same page that they need to combat terrorism. And I think FATF has done some very good job in the last 20 years or so. And there is good cooperation amongst the technical agencies of various countries, law enforcement agencies of various countries. India, for instance, has counterterrorism joint working groups with many countries, regular dialogue with most countries. And as a part of our strategic partnership, counterterrorism figures very highly. So I think those efforts have to continue and should continue. And these conferences that you have talked about, these are really the all the technical agencies, law enforcement agencies, legal agencies. They have come together, and this will certainly help in strengthening that cooperation and also sharing of resources, expertise, etc. For instance, there are any number of cases when the relevant agencies of several countries have come together based on certain intelligence and taken joint operations, particularly in the cyberspace, and have been able to unearth some of these nexus, etc. But I think the problem is larger. The problem is that terrorism is related to organized crime. Organized crime today constitutes, various estimates are there, maybe about 1.5 to 1.7% of the global GDP is constituted by organized crime. And there is a very strong crime-terror linkage. Then there is radicalization, which is amorphous, which is often spread through social media, through various technical means, and it's very difficult to control those platforms, which have become very big and and also most of the communication is encrypted. Then there is, of course, we talked about the politics of terrorism, but then is also this whole issue of technology, which Mr. Samir Patil talked about. This is becoming so big and so huge. The information is so huge that the question of skills and training, etc., is also becoming very important. So I think the international cooperation in these areas, despite the structural issues that we have, good terrorism, bad terrorism, etc., that is there. But I think there is still a lot of potential on the technical side, on financial side, on regulatory side, for the countries to come together. And I think India has done brilliantly by organizing and hosting these conferences and by maintaining that relentless focus for the last 2 or 3 decades on bringing terrorism and financing terrorism the global issue. And those efforts should continue.
Certainly. Professor Gunaratna, I'll take one last question from you. Challenges too many, solution perhaps too little, or still being worked upon by countries towards having a greater collaboration as far as counter-terrorism efforts are concerned. How do you look at the way ahead, especially at a time when the geopolitical churning is at an all-time high? We are living in a polarized world, and the world largely is consumed by the Russia-Ukraine war, the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, also the slowdown, the economic slowdown that we are witnessing. Amidst all of these issues, where does counter-terrorism effort stand?
Geopolitical fragmentation of the world is preventing cooperation across the world. So we have to build cooperation within regions and within sub-regions. But I think that there is something else which is even more important. To fight terrorism, we have to learn a huge mistake of the past. That is, terrorism is not only the domain of government. We have to work with community organizations, religious institutions, educational institutions, information and media institutions. We have to raise public awareness. We have to work very closely with the religious clerics, have programs to train religious clerics to promote moderation, toleration, coexistence. So unless we work in those 3 domains, the education, the religious and the information domain, we cannot win the fight. There is more radicalization today than ever before because emerging technologies are used. So I believe that India should seize this momentum to not only work with countries, but work with the banking institutions. For example, there are 100,000 banks in Indonesia to train those people how to detect terrorist money in the 4 stages of collection, storage, movement, and dispersal. So there's a lot more that has to be done with the public and with the non-security sectors, that is beyond military, law enforcement, intelligence, to build a more safer and a more secure world. Thank you.
That's right. I think that's a very important point that you've made, that it's a collective fight. Terrorism impacts us all, and therefore every stakeholder, citizens, community groups, all financial institutions, the security spectrum as well, have to collectively look at this fight and work on ways as to how to combat terrorism. With that, I'll have to wind up the program. Time is running out. Thank you once again to all 3 of you for joining me on this edition of the Global Debate, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers on this pertinent subject. And that's it from us, viewers, on this program today. I'll see you same time next week. Until then, you take good care of yourselves. Keep watching Sansad TV.